The Tony Hawk franchise was huge back in the day. So huge that Neversoft decided to release multiple versions of their games to make sure every gamer had a fair chance at playing the skating simulators. However, you may not know that some of the ports of these classic games had major differences. So today, we'll be talking about all kinds of Tony Hawk ports, small and large, to see how each Tony Hawk game was changed. Let's start things off with the original game that started it all. To be fair, just about every Pro Skater fan is familiar with the differences between the three ports of this game, so I'll try to make it short and sweet. The Nintendo 64 version is missing all the FMVs, the music was heavily altered to get rid of inappropriate language, and to fit on a cartridge that has a significant less amount of space compared to CDs. Other suggestive things were also changed, such as certain pieces of text, and there's this image of a woman that appears after a certain cheat code is entered. The Dreamcast version has better graphics, loads faster, and has cool VMU support. That's not all though, the N-Gage also had its own version of Pro Skater 1 too. For those unaware, the N-Gage was Nokia's attempt at handheld gaming, and to its credit, it does have a decent amount of games on it, and even connected to the GSM cellular network. As for the port itself, it's pretty much the PS1 version, so yeah, not much to see here. Wikipedia says there's a port of this game made for the Verizon Brew system, a network that allowed for people to download and play games on their mobile phones, but I couldn't find much about it, so yeah, sorry to disappoint. Pro Skater 2 is pretty much the same deal as its predecessor in terms of the PS1, Nintendo 64, and Dreamcast, but it does have a few more ports. Okay, so as I was editing this, I found that the Nintendo 64 port of this game actually has a level for Matt Hoffman's Pro BMX, which is not any other port, so yeah, just wanted to throw that in there. First off, the most notable one is Pro Skater 2X for the original Xbox. The game was given completely new graphics, runs at 60 frames a second, has 4-player multiplayer, and even has its own unique levels, though most of them suck, with the exception of the Tampa level, which was later reused for the Tampa level of Tony Hawk's Underground. Now if you want a version of Pro Skater 2 that runs at 60 frames and has those classic graphics from the PS1, you can try the PC or iOS port. The PC port on its own is pretty standard stuff, but installing the cumulative mod makes things so much better. It allows for widescreen support, modern controller compatibility, unlock frame rates, override the FOV, and even allows for levels from other Pro Skater games. So it's totally worth getting for a revamped Pro Skater 2 experience. The iOS port is neat too, with its major problem being you have to use touch controls, which just doesn't work well at all with these games. Speaking of which, you might be confused as to how I'm playing iOS games on an Android. Well, there's an iOS emulator called Touch HLE, and luckily, it runs Pro Skater 2 quite well. So if you have an Android and want to play this port, Touch HLE's got your back. So now that we talked about the PC port and the mobile port, let's talk about the Pocket PC. For those not in the know, the Pocket PC was a series of mobile devices that ran unique versions of Windows and could do most things the OS is known for, including being able to play games. So Neversoft was inspired to make a port for the devices. I don't have a Pocket PC, so I'm getting all of my information about this port from other parts of the internet. It seems the game plays with the player controlling the skater's movements with the left stick and performing tricks by pressing buttons on the touchscreen. Although there doesn't seem to be an HUD indicating which tricks the player will perform, so that's kinda odd. It also doesn't seem to run the greatest, but that could be due to the hardware of the specific model. Alright, Pro Skater 3 is where things get real juicy. First off, let's get the minor things out of the way. The Xbox port has X-Ray, a skeleton skater, and the oil rig level. Two really cool additions, and the PC port has Doom Guy, along with its own FMV of the team that ported the game trying their best to be skaters. I absolutely love this addition. The FMVs of the Neversoft team trying to skate were so charming, and it shows they were truly fun people at heart. So to see Gearbox do it as well, just makes everything oh so better. The PS1 and Nintendo 64 ports of this game are essentially scaled down versions of the PS2 game, with fog limiting the player's view distance, and smaller levels that are missing their special interactive elements to accommodate for the inferior hardware. Otherwise, it's pretty much the same game. Goes through the classic mode to unlock cheats, and characters with the revert to help out with the high score challenges. This game is also missing the cruise ship level, with the level called Downhill sort of taking its place. The reason I say sort of is this map doesn't have any goals or connections to career mode, so it's there for the player to just mess around in or try and get the highest possible combo. By the way, it's an alright map, I just wish it looped around back to the beginning of the map like Downhill Jam did. One thing I really disliked about this version is it's very hard to do a revert then follow it up with a manual. The timing feels so off compared to the PS2 version. I also dislike the lack of the secret characters, with Wolverine and Officer Dick being the only lockable skaters. I understand why Darth Maul may have been removed, but why couldn't they put in one more like Demoness or a Neversoft guy? Pro Skater 2 has 3 secret unlockable skaters, so why couldn't this port? Back then, this port was a lot more practical than it is nowadays. I'm just saying, there's no real reason to play this version over the superior 6th gen ports. and the PC version runs on literally any modern day hardware. If this was the only way for someone to play Pro Skater 3 due to reasons such as not being able to afford a new console, then yeah, it was totally cool and meaningful to get this port. But considering how cheap those old consoles are, how easily Pro Skater 3 runs on Windows 10/11 with the Party Mod patch, and how easy it is to emulate the console ports of these games, playing this version is more for curiosity seekers. Pro Skater 4 doesn't have any major differences between the 6th generation versions, but there was a PS1 port made, and quite honestly, I like this one a lot more than the Pro Skater 3 port. I guess that's probably due to me liking Pro Skater 4 more than 3, but still, the ability to freely do goals and not be limited by a time limit feels so natural. It makes for such a good gameplay flow. So there's two weird things about this port that stick out to me. Number one, the soundtrack isn't fully there when the player starts the game. They have to collect the songs and the levels if they want to hear the tunes that were licensed for this game, which is so odd considering this mechanic was not in Pro Skater 4's PS2 port, nor was it in any other Tony Hawk game before or after. Secondly, the secret characters for Pro Skater 4 aren't here. Rather, there's this guy called Little Person, who's just a small clown. I assume this is due to licensing issues, but I mean, if Wolverine made it into the PS1 port of Pro Skater 3, why couldn't Jango Fett or Eddie make it into the version of this game? Not to mention, Daisy wasn't a licensed character, so she could have made it into this version too. But alas, we have this funky fellow instead. Before I stop talking about this port, I also wanted to bring up Pro Skater 4's exclusive levels. Sewers is an underground skate park, and I think this map is just fine. It works with both free skate and the career mode, but I think the layout is a bit odd and uninspired. It's there for more classic skating. Little Big World shrinks the player down to a mouse as they skate about the top of the kitchen counter. I really like this map. I'm a sucker for games that have players scattering around a normal sized environment as a small being. I just wish this concept was brought over to the PS2 or PS3 because a map like this would have been great for a system that can handle larger maps. Think of all the rooms the player could skate their way through and all the pathways they could take if such a level was reworked and expanded to include the whole house. While still talking about Pro Skater 4, it had mobile phone ports, of which I could not get footage of, but there are these screenshots and small descriptions from Planet Tony Hawk that give some insight as to what they looked like and what they were. Posted at Doge Buddha here, I'm really flaky on the mobile phone ports of these games, so if you want to have a way better look at those versions, check out this video by Square Eyed Jack. It's very informative and actually goes into detail. Back to the video. Pro Skater 4 was also ported to the Tapware Zodiac and Digiblast, which were handheld consoles, and these versions are essentially just a GBA port of this game. Speaking of which, I want to bring up some of the Game Boy versions of the Pro Skater games, starting with the Game Boy Color, before we move on to the Underground games. So Tony Hawk's Pro Skater for the Game Boy Color is completely different from the gameplay of the console versions, which I guess makes sense. The GBC is just a handheld console, there's only so much it could handle, but let's disregard that and see what this version has to offer. Well, there's 3 game modes on this special cartridge. One where players perform a trick on a half-pipe, another which has players racing down a level against other skaters, and that same game mode, but it's a 1v1 instead of multiple skaters. So Pro Skater 2 for the GBC is more akin to the console versions. Players go around a small area, do tricks, and complete challenges if they're on the career mode. Speaking of which, the career mode doesn't have all the main levels, just a few from the PS1 version, and the game even allows for the player to choose the first 3 levels. No need to unlock the second or third map to keep going. Pro Skater 3 on GBC is similar to its predecessor, but manuals are here, and it somehow looks worse. Like, look at the skater's model, it looks so bad. There's also another weird change. The player can't freely explore the map. If they want to move to a higher or lower layer, they have to wait until they get to either end of the map and use the D-pad to change their elevation. In my opinion, none of these ports are really worth playing today. They're fun to play for like 2 seconds and for curiosity's sake, but after that, you just want to play the actual games they're based off of. At least Pro Skater 3 and 4 for the PS1 were close enough to their respective 6th generation versions, so that they didn't feel like completely different games, and also had enough fun and differences to justify their existence. These ports feel kinda soulless, and really don't have anything to offer. I guess that applies to a lot of Game Boy ports of popular games at the time. They knew people were gonna want to play the game on the go, so they made a version that works just enough to fit in with the gameplay of the original for a quick buck. Pro Skater 2 and 3 were also ports to the Game Boy Advance. These ports, naturally, feel a lot better than the GBC ports. It's pseudo 3D isometric gameplay, but the controls don't feel too bad. The idea to make the shoulder buttons grab and flip tricks makes sense, and allows for players to grind and ollie without having to fight with the controls. Both games also have their respective secret superhero skaters too, so that's a real nice touch that's always appreciated. Pro Skater 2 even has the rooftops level from 2X, which is surprising to me because I think this is like the only time a 2X level has appeared outside of that port. Before we move on, I just want to say I think the main menu for Pro Skater 3 is genius. It's such a simple concept. Choose your options with the left or right button, and each option even shows up on the HD perfectly. Such a neat and very practical idea. Pro Skater 4 and the Underground GBA ports all have fairly similar gameplay. Explore the maps, find an NPC, and they'll give the player a task to do in order to progress. Like their console counterparts, the Underground games also have some story and allow the player to get off their board, although these controls kinda suck. They don't work really that well with the isometric angle and the D-pad controls. The Underground 2 port also has compressed versions of the songs featured in the console versions. They have extremely low bit rates, only a couple of songs could be included, and they're not even the full song, just a few of the verses and chorus on repeat. Despite that, it is nice to have this, considering how important the soundtrack is when playing these games, and the GBC versions had alright music loops that frankly didn't fit in with the radical nature of skating, so this was definitely the way to go with the soundtrack in my opinion. So while I also don't really recommend these ports, I also don't think they're bad iterations of their respective source material. I certainly had a lot more fun with the GBA versions than I did with the GBC versions. They actually feel like Tony Hawk games, even if they were also largely neutered. The Game Boy Advance games also had multiple cool unlockables. It was actually worth going through the career mode for, unlike the Game Boy Color versions that hardly gave players anything for their accomplishments. I would recommend these to the more hardcore and curious fans of the series, but I will also say, if you skip them, you're not missing anything. Before we get back on track, I just wanted to mention that each of the GBA ports also has a secret character called Mindy, although she doesn't look anything like Mindy from American Wasteland, so I guess she was Vicarious Vision's attempt at something like Private Carrera or Daisy. Now, we got Tony Hawk's Underground 2 remix for the PSP. I mean, the name pretty much describes this port perfectly. Underground 2 with new things, and a fairly different campaign. Yeah, the career mode has completely new levels, and they even have their own fun goals and unlockable characters. It even has new cutscenes too, which really adds on to the value of playing this game, even if you've already 100% of the base game. I actually had a lot of fun doing some of the new challenges, and skating through the exclusive levels. They work real well with the Underground 2 engine, and everything connects. It was also nice to see that it includes every unlockable from the base game too, so all of my favorite characters were still there waiting for me to choose them on the split screen, so they could bust out some sick combos. Classic mode was left untouched, but I'm okay with that considering how great it was in the PS2 version, so if it's not broken, don't fix it. Unfortunately, American Wasteland didn't get a cool enhanced port for the PSP, but it did get American Skateland for the DS. I think this is the first true Tony Hawk game for the Nintendo handhelds. Don't get me wrong, the Game Boy Advance games were cool and fun for small periods of time, but the DS allowed for Vicarious Visions to really capture the Tony Hawk formula from the Nintendo handhelds just right. It's mostly due to allowing for actual 3D gameplay instead of that isometric view which created a pseudo 3D playground for the advanced games. But still, such innovation makes Skateland feel so free and fun. The bottom screen displaying the map and other pieces of helpful information is such a nice touch, and significantly helped me navigate my way through the maps. Anyways, the gameplay is close to American Wasteland, with players talking to NPCs and doing what they say, then moving on to the next level, with a little bit of story sprinkled here and there. Speaking of which, the story in this game has actual cutscenes, even if they aren't all that animated, and there's even voice acting instead of the text-only dialogue from the GBA ports, so yeah, props to Vicarious Visions for making the game more immersive and interesting. One more thing about the career mode, players can buy pieces for a custom skating part with the money they obtain from missions. I guess this is supposed to be this game's branch, with the player being able to place all kinds of pieces, and being able to customize them to their liking. It's a neat feature, but I didn't really use it. Just like American Wasteland, Skateland also has a classic mode with most of the levels writ straight from the story mode, but there is Alcatraz from Pro Skater 4 in this version, so again, I think it's always nice to see some post-Pro Skater 3 levels in these games. Overall, I really like the support of American Wasteland. The controls feel good for the most part, the challenges are small but engaging enough, having full songs for the soundtrack and having actual cutscenes added on to the immersion and fun of this game. So if you want some portable Tony Hawk fun, Skateland from the DS is a good option. Before we move on, this game was also ported to the Game Boy Advance, and it's practically the same as the GBA Underground games, except the story is different. Sorry for being short with this one, there's only so much of these ports a man can play before going insane. I do want to mention before moving on that each of these games has their own version of Mindy, with the GBA version having the most different one of them all. Let me know which Mindy design you think is the best in the comments. Alright, let's talk about the 6th gen ports of Project 8 next. The biggest difference players will notice is that the individual sections of the map have to be loaded in separately, meaning the player can't freely go from section to section. They have to pause the game and change the level. It's kind of lame, although it's not like it completely kills the flow of the gameplay. Personally, I would have just made it so the skating moves really slow from map to map, kind of like how American Wasteland was, but I suppose that would have been really hard to do considering how the game would have to account for changing the terrain and layout. I'm just saying, the PS2 had open world games that didn't require the player to wait for a loading screen to get to the next part of the map, but most of them were made by big talented teams, so it's not fair to compare them to Shaba's team of resources. Another big cut was the player's ability to build their own set in certain places. Yeah, I guess the PS2 was already pushing with this game, so having to load in additional assets for this game would have been too much. So Shabba decided to cut this feature for optimization reasons, I'm guessing. Anyways, some other differences include the streets are less populated, the levels aren't as complex, and most of the in-game cutscenes were turned into pre-rendered cutscenes for some reason. Personally, I think the PS2 could have handled them just fine, but that would have taken more time and effort, so maybe Shabba was doing the best they could with what they had. Really, the only in-game cutscenes present are the ones that demonstrate the players unlocked a new piece of the level they're currently on. Otherwise, everything else is pre-rendered. Otherwise, this is a fairly faithful port of Project 8 to the PS2 and other similar systems. Most of the challenges, unlockables, and levels are the same between the two versions, so it's not like the experience is completely different between the 6th generation and 7th generation consoles. I would still recommend the PS3 and Xbox 360 versions, but the 6th gen ports are just fine. Now, the PSP port of Project 8 is practically the same as the PS2 version, with 3 differences. First, a manual can be started by holding square, which is very odd to me considering I manual just fine by pressing up and down. Second, the player can't get off their board, which is also odd considering Underground 2 Remix had it, even if it felt slow and sluggish. And the best for last, this version has a dedicated classic mode which was pretty much stripped from American Wasteland, but has a really cool twist. Players can choose whether they want amateur, professional, or sick goals. Each difficulty's goals are unique and are obviously harder as the player climbs up the ladder. Another thing about this classic mode is that it even has maps from Pro Skater 4 and Underground 1, and those were very welcome additions considering there hasn't been a game after those entries that really reused their maps. The classic maps from Underground 2 and American Wasteland were from Pro Skater 1, 2, and 3, so seeing those maps again felt like a breath of fresh air, even if they were rehashes. The only issue I have with this mode is that nothing is unlocked whenever the player beats it, and so while it is pretty fun, there's little reason to complete it considering there's nothing to gain from it. Don't get me wrong, it's a real fun classic mode, but there really isn't a mode to complete it other than bragging rights. Okay, so before we move on to Proving Ground, there's another game that I have to bring up real quick. A spin-off known as Downhill Jam was released in 2006 for the PS2 and Wii, and it's more focused on speed and racing than pulling off cool tricks. I'm not gonna lie, I only played the DS GBA version for this game, so I'm just gonna review them as standalone games. The DS version is actually pretty fun. The bite-sized missions are challenging enough and are quite varied. The controls are pretty good too. I feel like I have control over my skater and their board, even during sections where I had to get around tight bends. The story is okay, although I'm not sure what I expected from a DS game in that aspect. To be truthful, I played the GBA port for like 5 minutes, then decided that was enough. Like, just look at this gameplay. It's as fun as it looks, and this is honestly one of the worst looking GBA games I've seen. It's so hard on the eyes. Was it worth it for Activision to port this crap to the GBA for a quick buck? Maybe not, but this is Activision we're talking about, so anything for some money, yeah? Now, onto Proving Ground's 6th gen ports. Just like Project 8, each section is its own level, and has to be loaded in separately. So that neat feature that never saw a push for this game is again, not here at all. Otherwise, everything that was in the 7th generation ports lies within this version of the game too. I think this version of the game is alright. My biggest complaint lies within the progression. So, in the PS3 and Xbox 360 versions of this game, the player will unlock more of the challenges with the specific ladder they're going down as they beat them. And that was something I really enjoyed about Proving Ground. If the player solely wanted to do hardcore missions for the time being, they could, because Proving Ground would keep giving them those challenges until they ran out, of course. As someone who enjoyed the hardcore levels the most, I loved this feature. I was never forced to do a mission I wanted to put off, but couldn't, so it really helped with the flow of the gameplay. The 7th gen versions don't allow for such freedom, so the player is going to have to do other goals if they want to get the next specific challenge they want, because they're unlocked by getting enough points to progress to the next level. One more thing I want to bring up about this port is that all the cutscenes take place from a first-person perspective. Obviously, the custom skater couldn't appear in the FMVs, so to work around this, the cutscenes take place from the custom skater, which I guess makes sense and is a fairly decent way of covering that up. That's not all for Proving Ground though. A DS version was also made. It's pretty much what American Wasteland is to American Skateland, a portable version of the game that has players doing challenges and levels on the console ports. This game does have the hardcore and career goals, no rigging challenges, which I guess makes sense considering the technology probably wasn't able to handle such a thing. And a lot of those missions also have the player getting off their board, which they can't do in this one, and even if they could, I'm sure the parkour physics would have been very clunky. Speaking of which, like Pro Skater 3's PS1 port, it feels so awkward pulling off a revert to manual combo in this game. It feels as if I have to press up and down multiple times to make sure the inputs are registered, and so my skater does the manual. I don't know why the handheld ports struggle with this aspect. Anyways, I want to mention that this port actually has the FMVs from the console version of Proving Ground, and I think that's neat. They're compressed to hell, sure, but the fact they're here is cool to me because the developers went out of their way to put this onto a cartridge that probably already has a bunch of other data on it to really get players pumped to be skating. This port also includes a classic mode, and it's fun enough. but since it doesn't really unlock anything, it's mostly there for players to get more playtime out of this game. In conclusion, this may not be the most faithful iteration of Proving Ground, but it's still fun. The career is engaging enough, and the classic mode is a fun little addition to add on to the enjoyment, so I would recommend it for some portable Tony Hawk fun. So we're finally out of the Neversoft era, but the differences don't quite end. Pro Skater 5 actually has a few differences between 7th gen and 8th gen, with 3 exclusive levels and 3 exclusive skaters, only available on the PS4 and Xbox One. The differences don't end there either. The PlayStation versions had special heads players could put on their skaters, including Sackboy, Sweet Tooth, and Ratchet. And the Xbox versions had Cuphead, Mugman, and the main character from Sunset Overdrive. Just for the record, I wouldn't recommend any port of Pro Skater 5 to anybody because this game sucks. It's garbage. Don't play this under any circumstance, it's not worth it. Okay, this section is going to be a speedrun for other version differences I can think of. PAL versions of Pro Skater 1 have a few songs from European artists in their soundtrack, and it's named Tony Hawk Skateboarding. Pro Skater 2's Korean release had the pop group Fin KL as playable characters, and some of their songs as part of the soundtrack. The Japanese version of Pro Skater 2 has these 4 exclusive skaters. 2 of them are real life people, but when I searched for the other 2 guys, I couldn't really find anything other than Sukahachi being the Japanese word for skateboard. And Pro Skater 4 in Japan was called Pro Skater 2003, despite releasing in 2004. So that wraps up most of the Tony Hawk ports. It was pretty interesting going through every port and seeing what changes were made in order for the system to be able to handle the smaller iterations. We saw some really big changes, like the GBC port of Pro Skater 1 being completely different from its base game, and some more faithful changes like American Skateland's inclusion of a story with actual cutscenes and a classic mode. Java Games did a good job at creating functional ports that were still fun for the last gen consoles, as they still have a lot of the same enjoyment from the more capable versions of said games. Vicarious Visions got really creative when it came to taking the gameplay of the console ports and making them work with the limitations of the GBA and DS. The fact that most of them had some of the songs from the console versions was such a necessary inclusion, considering how essential they are to the series. Alright, that's about all I had to say for this video. Have a good day and let me know what you think about some of the ports I went over for this video.